The evening air over Willowbrook pressed down with the oppressive weight of late August, heavy with the mingling scents of cut grass, damp earth, and the faint, lingering perfume of magnolias in bloom. The sky was a bruised shade of purple, sunlight dimming to copper streaks along the horizon as Catherine Hartwell stepped from the grand veranda of the main house, her parasol unused and hanging limp at her side. It had been 3 minutes, a mere 180 seconds, since she left her children upstairs, safe for the night, yet every second had been enough for the long-caged fury in her chest to swell into something monstrous. The transformation had been silent, invisible, a slow unraveling of all the fragile civility that had defined her life as Edmund Hartwell's lawful wife. The knife, small but formidable, was hidden within the folds of her dress, its cold, familiar weight pressed against her thigh. 3 generations of Hartwell women had carried it, an heirloom, a symbol of family pride and protection. Tonight, it would become a tool of justice, or perhaps vengeance. Catherine herself could not tell the difference. Each step across the dew-specked lawn was deliberate, almost ritualistic. She measured the distance to Rachel's cottage not in feet, but in the accumulation of humiliation, grief, and envy that had gnawed at her since the day she realized her husband's heart had long departed for the enslaved woman who bore none of the formalities of a lawful wife, but held every piece of his affection. Her mind replayed, with meticulous clarity, the years of being ignored, of feeling invisible in the halls she once filled with laughter and pride. Edmund's love, given freely to Rachel, was like sunlight she had been denied. She remembered the first pregnancy when Edmund's hand had never lingered over her swelling belly, how she had longed for the tender attentions that Rachel now received with ease, as if borne to her arms. The thought coiled, tighter inside Catherine, a snake of fury and humiliation, until each heartbeat seemed to echo a verdict of judgment. By the time she neared the 3 small steps leading to the porch of the modest cottage, Catherine no longer felt like a woman but a force of inevitable destruction. The cottage itself was unassuming, its whitewashed walls humble in comparison to the grandeur of Willowbrook's main house. But to Catherine, it represented every affront she had endured. The quiet authority of her husband's attentions, the domestic intimacy she had never known, the life he had built in her absence, and most sharply, the life that would continue to flourish after her death if she did not intervene. Edmund and Rachel were there, sitting close, Rachel's hand resting on her rounded belly, fingers splayed in protective guardianship of the life growing within her. Edmund's own hand mirrored the gesture, brushing hers, communicating warmth, trust, and something Catherine could not name without tasting bile. The tableau was ordinary in appearance, a man and his companion, enjoying a book, their voices gentle, the evening serene, but in Catherine's eyes, it was a spectacle of betrayal, a proof of her inadequacy and neglect. Her lips parted slightly as she spoke, though her voice carried no tremor, no hint of the hurricane of emotion that had built behind it. "Edmund," she said. It was a flat, uninflected sound, a sound that chilled the air in ways that neither man nor woman could mistake. The knife pressed closer against her leg, and for a moment, time seemed to halt as the world waited for her next movement. Edmund looked up, brows knitting with a mixture of irritation and resignation, as though he had known this confrontation would come, as though he had been waiting his entire life for her final eruption. "Catherine, what are you doing here?" he asked, calm yet weary. "We've discussed this. You have the main house, and I have my life here with Rachel. There's no reason for us to continue these scenes. Our marriage is over in everything but legal form, and you need to accept that." Catherine's lips curved, not in pleasure but in recognition of the clarity that had finally settled in her chest. "Our marriage was over the day you decided you loved her more than your own family," she said, each word measured, precise, loaded with years of unspoken anguish. "But you're right, these scenes need to end. Tonight, permanently." The knife emerged almost instinctively, catching the fading copper light of the evening as Catherine lunged forward. Edmund tried to rise, but the first stab caught his shoulder, slicing through muscle and sinew, forcing him to stumble. His scream tore through the quiet of the grounds, a raw human sound, mingling terror and disbelief. Catherine withdrew the knife with practiced efficiency, her eyes cold, her face a mask of fury. Rage had given her strength beyond her usual form, the strength to act decisively, to impose her will upon the only 2 people she held accountable for her suffering. Rachel attempted to rise, to flee into the cottage, but Catherine was faster. With hands that were steadier than Rachel could have imagined, she caught the pregnant woman by the hair, pulling her back onto the porch. The sight of Catherine standing over her victims, the knife held like a conductor's baton, was surreal, almost mythic, a white woman in a flowing dress, hair disheveled, eyes blazing with the fire of accumulated grievances, wielding the instrument of death with purpose. Each motion was precise, almost ritualistic, as if Catherine had rehearsed the choreography for years, letting nothing disturb the rhythm of retribution she had envisioned. "You took everything from me," she gasped as she struck again and again, puncturing flesh without hesitation. Her words were less speech than litany, a recitation of every wrong inflicted by the impossibility of her situation. "Your property. You're supposed to be mine to control, but he loved you instead of me, even though I'm his wife, even though the law says you belong to us." Rachel's hands instinctively rose to protect her belly, the unborn child, Edmund's child, the final seal of his devotion, yet each movement was futile. She gasped for mercy, for life, for the impossible. "Please," she cried through blood that filled her lungs, "please, the baby hasn't done anything wrong. Please let the baby live, even if you have to kill me. Please." Catherine's fury, however, had surpassed reason. Every stab, every slice, was a release of pent-up torment, a physical manifestation of her inability to reconcile social power with emotional impotence. Her ancestor's knife had become a tool of destiny, her own hands delivering the impossible verdict on a system that had allowed white men unrestrained access to enslaved women while offering white wives no recourse. Each strike was history, personal and systemic, colliding with flesh and bone in a brutal symphony of vengeance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, sinister shadows across the small garden and the porch, Catherine finally paused, standing over the bloody tableau she had created. Edmund lay in the garden, wounded, bleeding, unable to act, a living testament to her wrath and desperation. Rachel's body slumped across the porch, silent, still, a casualty of both love and the rigid structures that allowed it to flourish, only to destroy. The air was thick with metallic scent, with the smell of iron, earth, and the sweat of exertion. Catherine's chest heaved, her mind beginning the slow transition from rage to awareness, the first faint tremors of horror settling in as she took in the scene she had wrought. 3 minutes, 3 hours, 3 years, none of it mattered. The knife, still warm in her hand, was no longer an instrument of purpose but a symbol of the violence that social structures, love, jealousy, and property had conspired to produce. She turned away from the porch, leaving behind the remnants of her fury, her vengeance, and her rage, stepping back into the darkening evening with the silent weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders. The walk back to the main house would be another journey, another confrontation with her own conscience, and the world of consequences that she had set in motion. But for now, the immediate act, the act that transformed her from wronged wife to historical figure, was complete, and Catherine Hartwell's steps, deliberate and unhurried, carried her away from the cottage where love, jealousy, and death had collided with irrevocable finality. Catherine's approach had been deliberate, each step on the lawn a countdown to the inevitable, yet nothing in her careful choreography prepared her for the moment. She placed her hand upon the sun-warmed railing of Rachel's modest porch. The wood creaked slightly beneath her fingers, a sound that seemed amplified in the evening stillness, as though the house itself were alerting its occupants to the storm about to break. Her eyes fixed on the pair before her, Edmund reclining slightly with his usual posture of careless ease, and Rachel, her belly rounded with the child that symbolized both love and transgression, her fingers tracing patterns in the cloth of her dress. The scene struck Catherine with a cruel immediacy. The domestic perfection she had been denied mirrored in flesh and form, mocking her own lack of influence over the man to whom she was legally bound. Her voice, low and cold, cut through the soft hum of crickets and the rustle of the evening breeze. "Edmund," she said, almost ceremoniously, drawing their attention with the precision of a conductor beginning a symphony of violence. Edmund lifted his head, recognizing the tone immediately. It was not the voice of a woman requesting reconciliation, nor a wife seeking acknowledgement. It was the voice of someone whose mind had crystallized into a singular, unalterable purpose. Catherine's eyes, dark and glinting with an intensity forged over 5 years of marital neglect and humiliation, betrayed no hesitation. The knife, hidden in her dress, rested like a silent promise at her thigh, waiting for her hand to grant it life. "Catherine," Edmund said, voice measured but tired, almost resigned. "We have discussed this many times. You have the main house. I have Rachel. We need not continue these disturbances." He shifted slightly, the muscles in his shoulders tensing, the faintest tremor betraying awareness of danger. "Our marriage exists only in legal form, not in affection, and you must accept this." His eyes, dark and calculating, flicked to Rachel, whose own gaze met his, a silent acknowledgement of shared intimacy and fragile security. Catherine's response was instantaneous, sharpened like the blade at her side. "Our marriage ended the moment you placed her above your own family, but you are correct, these scenes will end tonight, permanently." The knife emerged in a fluid, terrifying motion, catching the last light of the dying sun and flashing briefly with a cold brilliance. Edmund's eyes widened, processing too late the immediacy of the threat. Catherine lunged forward, her motion a combination of practiced efficiency and unbridled fury, striking the first blow into his right shoulder. The scream that escaped Edmund's throat tore the air, a raw, jagged sound that mingled terror with disbelief. He tried to rise, tried to deflect, but Catherine was relentless, her anger granting her unnatural speed and strength. Each movement was precise, unhesitating, as though her body had internalized the litany of wrongs she had suffered over half a decade. Rachel, momentarily frozen by shock, tried to rise as well, but Catherine's eyes, blazing, followed her every motion. She seized Rachel by the hair, yanking her back to the wooden porch, her grip firm, unyielding, and terrifyingly strong. "You took everything from me," Catherine gasped, her voice strained with a combination of exertion and fury. "You were supposed to be mine to control. He loved you instead of me, even though I am his wife, even though the law says you belong to us." Each word punctuated the violence of her actions, as if speaking aloud justified, or at least explained, the carnage she was about to inflict. Her strikes were rhythmic, almost mechanical, a grim testament to the years of resentment she had stored within herself. The knife punctured flesh with alarming regularity, each blow a physical articulation of emotional torment that had no other outlet. Rachel struggled desperately, her hands instinctively rising to protect the life growing within her. "Please," she pleaded through choked sobs and blood that filled her mouth. "Please, the baby hasn't done anything wrong. Please let the baby live, even if you must take me instead. Please." The terror and desperation in her voice only fueled Catherine's resolve. She had come not merely to punish, but to assert control over a situation that had systematically stripped her of power. Every stab, every cut, was a reclamation of agency in a world that offered her none. Edmund, meanwhile, lay sprawled across the porch and spilling into the garden below, his body trembling with shock and pain, unable to intervene. The knife had disabled his right arm, and subsequent blows had left him struggling to draw breath, gurgling as blood filled his lungs. His expression, however, remained fixed in a complex tableau. Fear, pain, and an unspoken recognition of Catherine's determination, mingled with an almost imperceptible trace of pity. Even as death crept closer, he understood that the woman before him was not merely enraged, but transformed into an instrument of retribution and despair, shaped by both personal grievance and the cruel hierarchies of plantation society. Catherine's strikes continued, relentless. Each puncture of flesh, each spray of blood across the weathered wooden boards, was a violent punctuation to the narrative of her marriage, her frustration, and the social conventions that had trapped her. She moved with a terrifying clarity, an almost dissociative precision, as if the emotional enormity of the act required her mind to split from the reality of its consequences. Her fury was not directed solely at Rachel. It was aimed at a system that allowed a husband's affection to be distributed outside marriage, that permitted love, desire, and protection to flourish in a legally and racially unequal relationship, while denying Catherine recourse. The garden below became a stage for Edmund's slow demise, his body a testament to both Catherine's speed and the inevitability of her vengeance. Rachel's pleading had faltered, her cries now mere gurgles as life drained from her body, each drop of blood a symbol of the impossible entanglement of love, property, and power. Catherine stood over the bodies, chest heaving, eyes dark with exertion and triumph, but also with the first stirrings of awareness. The tableau she had created was horrifying in its completeness. The legal husband, the enslaved lover, both victims of a violent reordering of the social order, both casualties of a marriage, an institution, and a plantation system that had failed to provide human resolution to human emotion. Time, in those moments, seemed both infinite and compressed. Catherine's mind began to shift subtly from the immediacy of rage to the consideration of aftermath. She stepped back from Rachel's still body, glancing down at Edmund in the garden, gurgling, eyes dimming with the inevitability of death. Her heart pounded, not with anticipation, but with the dawning awareness that the act was done, that nothing would reverse the consequences of this night. The knife, once a symbol of control and inheritance, now rested heavy in her hand, a burden of irrevocable consequence. The shadows lengthened as the sun finally vanished, leaving the porch, the cottage, and the garden in deepening twilight. Catherine's breaths came in slow, deliberate intervals, her body still trembling from exertion and adrenaline. The weight of reality pressed down upon her, the full magnitude of what she had accomplished. Edmund, wounded beyond aid, Rachel dead upon the boards of the porch, the finality of her vengeance complete settling with oppressive force. Yet she felt no triumph, only the grim satisfaction of a mission executed with the precision of years of pent-up rage, and the first tremors of horror at the path her own hands had carved through lives and history. She took one final step back, surveying the scene, letting the silence press upon her ears, broken only by the faint, rattling gurgle of Edmund in the garden. Every detail, every arrangement, was fixed in her mind. The way Rachel's dress had clung to her, the pattern of blood on the boards, the garden flowers now soaked with life's essence, the copper tones of the evening sky darkening over the devastation. This moment, Catherine knew, would define not just her fate, but the story of Willowbrook itself, a narrative of marital failure, social hierarchy, racial and gendered violence, and the terrible consequences of unmitigated desire and jealousy. The echoes of Catherine's fury did not fade with the Sunday. The screams, muffled at first by the walls of Rachel's cottage, then piercing the open air of the Willowbrook lawn, drew the attention of those few enslaved people still tending the estate in the evening hours. Marcus, head gardener, and a man whose vigilance had been forged over decades of watching for the unpredictable whims of the white family he served, had been pruning rose bushes near the orchard when the first piercing scream cut through the humid Virginia air. He froze, understanding instinctively that something far beyond routine conflict had erupted. Though fear pulsed through his veins, trained caution compelled him to remain hidden. To intervene directly was to invite immediate death. To watch, to bear witness silently, was the only choice available to a man legally considered property, whose voice carried no weight in the courts of Virginia. Marcus crouched behind the low hedge bordering the cottage garden, heart hammering against his ribs, as he observed Catherine's figure moving with lethal purpose across the porch. The knife glinted intermittently, catching the last remnants of daylight, each flash a punctuation to the horror unfolding before him. Edmund, his right arm useless from the initial strike, struggled against the inevitability of Catherine's vengeance, gurgling sounds rising from his lungs that were slowly filling with blood. Rachel's protests, initially loud and desperate, had grown faint, choked by blood and terror. Marcus's eyes followed each movement with a mixture of horror and analytical detachment, understanding that this was no impulsive quarrel, but a meticulously executed act of violence shaped by 5 years of humiliation, jealousy, and social frustration. The realization struck him with oppressive weight. The mistress of Willowbrook, a woman who had lived in social and legal comfort, had chosen to commit a double murder, and she had done so in the open, before the eyes of anyone who might have interfered, yet beyond reach of legal intervention due to the racial and social hierarchies that governed their lives. Marcus understood the impossible position he was in. To act was to risk death, yet to remain silent was to bear witness to the complete and utter destruction of his master and the woman he loved. So he remained, hidden behind the foliage, taking in the full scope of the carnage. As Catherine's frenzy subsided, replaced by a dawning awareness of what she had done, she stepped back from the bodies, breathing heavily, the knife still in her hand. Edmund's gurgles became fainter, his eyes dimming, yet fixed in a final, complex expression that seemed to convey both fear and a reluctant recognition of Catherine's actions. Marcus noted the eerie calm that settled over Catherine as she surveyed the aftermath, an unsettling transition from homicidal rage to measured reflection. The evening light had fully surrendered to darkness, leaving only the faint glow of the moon on the porch, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the surrounding gardens, marking the boundary between life and death, action and consequence. Catherine's movements became methodical, almost ritualistic, as if planning for what came next. She did not flee. She did not attempt to conceal her crime. Instead, she moved with deliberate intent toward the main house, ensuring that her children were safely away, protected from witnessing the night's events. Her actions suggested both residual rationality and an awareness of social perception, even as the psychological weight of her deeds began to settle upon her. Marcus watched silently, noting the deliberate manner in which she arranged her letters, penned explanations, and prepared for the ultimate act of self-destruction. This attention to detail highlighted the duality of her state, homicidal yet rational, despairing yet controlled, emotionally unmoored yet socially cognizant. The witnesses multiplied, though none dared approach. Other enslaved people, drawn by the cries, observed from various hiding places. Elizabeth, a house servant, watched from a window of the main house. John, a field hand, crouched behind a stack of firewood near the barn. Each understood the rules of survival within the rigid confines of plantation life. Interference could mean death. Silence could ensure continued life. What they saw, however, was enough to imprint a permanent memory. Catherine, once the embodiment of social and racial privilege, transformed into an agent of absolute destruction, claiming the lives of both the legal master and the woman whose existence challenged the hierarchical order she represented. Catherine's methodical care in ensuring her children were away from harm and writing explanatory letters reflected the complexity of her psychological state. She moved from the porch to the nursery, confirming that her arrangements to protect her children from the night's violence had succeeded. Her subsequent retreat to the bedroom was performed with mechanical precision. She bathed, changed into a clean dress, and set about writing 3 letters, one addressed to her children, attempting to rationalize the murders within the framework of marital betrayal and social inevitability, another to her parents, apologizing for the scandal and begging them to raise her orphan children with care, and a third, a confession to the authorities, explicitly detailing the murders and asserting sole responsibility. Each letter was placed deliberately, a record of intent and rationale that demonstrated her awareness of history, perception, and the permanence of her actions. Finally, Catherine prepared for her own death. The same knife, once a symbol of familial heritage and marital grievance, became the instrument of her suicide. She filled the bathtub with water, positioned herself carefully, and opened her wrists, allowing her life to bleed into the water, a quiet, controlled act following the chaos she had wrought outside. Marcus, still hidden, perceived the symbolic weight of the act, a woman who had destroyed the lives around her now controlling the final act of her own mortality. The scene that awaited discovery, her body in the blood-tinged water, letters neatly arranged on the desk, would provide a chilling testament to both method and madness. The discovery of the bodies occurred in stages. Marcus remained concealed, understanding the peril of direct engagement. Elizabeth, the house servant, found Catherine's corpse approximately 2 hours after the murders, when concern drove her to check on the mistress who had not emerged from her bedroom. The color of the water, the stillness of the body, and the meticulous placement of letters confirmed the grim sequence. Double murder followed by suicide, executed with calculated precision. Following Catherine's death, attention returned to the cottage. Edmund's body lay in the garden, blood-soaked and lifeless, while Rachel's corpse on the porch bore countless knife wounds, the physical record of unrestrained fury and grief. The enslaved witnesses faced immediate psychological and social crises. With the plantation's master dead and the mistress gone, normal mechanisms of authority were disrupted. The overseer attempted to assert control, but without Edmund's backing, his power was tenuous at best. The enslaved people considered flight, relocation, or silent endurance, all while understanding the fragility of their own security. The murders, witnessed in part by those who could claim no legal authority or protection, became both a psychological trauma and a practical crisis. Families faced the threat of dispersal, property risk, and legal ambiguity, particularly concerning the estate's control and the future of the orphan children. The immediate aftermath solidified the broader impact of Catherine's actions. Her children, returning from relatives 2 days later, were confronted with the permanent absence of both parents. Enslaved families, tightly bound by years of proximity and shared labor, faced dispersal as the estate was sold, altering the social and economic fabric of Willowbrook irrevocably. Marcus was sold to a plantation in Georgia, Elizabeth to a North Carolina family. The community that had formed on the plantation workers, caretakers, and even those considered property was dismantled, leaving only memory and trauma in the wake of violent disruption. The events of that evening, witnessed silently by those trapped within the racial and social hierarchy, demonstrated the fragility of authority, the terror that unchecked rage could unleash, and the impossibility of true protection for those considered property. The murders and suicide were not merely personal tragedies, but emblematic of the structural contradictions of plantation society. The unregulated power of white women over households, the lack of legal or social recourse for marital betrayal, and the vulnerability of enslaved people caught between competing claims of ownership, affection, and survival. The night descended on Willowbrook with a heavy, almost sentient darkness, as though the very air mourned the violence that had erupted on the plantation. Catherine Hartwell, her body still trembling from the exertion and rage of the murders, moved with deliberate precision through the grand hallways of the main house. The walls, adorned with portraits of ancestors whose privileges had once shielded her from pain, now seemed to leer at her, silent witnesses to the collapse of her world. Each step echoed faintly across the polished floors, a metronome counting down the last hours of her life. The heat of the Virginia summer had not abated. Instead, it pressed upon her skin, sticky and suffocating, as if the plantation itself conspired to weigh her down under the weight of guilt and inevitability. Her children, a daughter of 10 and a son of 8, were safely away with relatives, an arrangement she had made hours before with methodical foresight. The knowledge that they would not witness the night's horrors brought her a fleeting sense of relief, though it did nothing to quell the storm of emotions surging within her. Relief mingled with sorrow, with exhaustion, with the lingering adrenaline of violence, and with the cold rationality of what must come next. Catherine's thoughts cycled between the horror of what she had done and the necessity of ensuring that her actions, and the reasons behind them, would be comprehensible to those left behind, however fragmented and incomplete that understanding might be. She entered her bedroom, closing the door with deliberate care, and began the preparation that would mark the final hours of her existence. Her movements were calm, almost mechanical. She filled the bathtub, adjusting the water to a temperature that would facilitate a swift death without excess pain, and laid out a clean dress, carefully folding her bloodied garments into a bundle. The knife that had delivered both vengeance and justice, depending on one's perspective, remained on the counter beside her. Its handle, worn smooth by decades of family inheritance, seemed to hum with the weight of history and familial expectation, a silent reminder that her actions were rooted not merely in personal betrayal, but in generations of inherited privilege and entitlement. The first letters she wrote were addressed to her children. Catherine's handwriting, precise and legible despite the chaos of her emotional state, conveyed a woman attempting to rationalize the unthinkable. She explained that the deaths of their father and Rachel were the result of circumstances that had left her no alternative, framing her actions as a final resolution to 5 years of humiliation and emotional neglect. Her words were calculated to shield them from immediate horror, while simultaneously imparting a sense of moral justification, or at least moral reasoning, from the perspective of someone whose world had been defined by social hierarchy and legal privilege. "I know you will hate me for what I have done," she wrote, the ink blotting slightly under the weight of tears she refused to shed publicly. "But I hope someday you will understand that your father's love for Rachel made it impossible for me to continue living. I tried everything I could think of to end the situation or to bear it, but nothing worked. He loved her more than he loved me, more than he loved you, more than he loved anything in this world, and I could not live knowing that I meant nothing to him while she meant everything." The second letter, addressed to her parents, carried the tone of apology and explanation, seeking absolution from those who had once been her anchors in a world that now seemed to offer no comfort. She detailed the sequence of events, carefully omitting gratuitous detail, while emphasizing her perception of inevitability and moral compulsion. Her parents, she wrote, would be left to raise the children and manage the aftermath of a scandal that would ripple across the plantation and the broader community. She begged them to approach the task with honesty and compassion, ensuring that her children would understand, when ready, the tragic calculus that had governed her final decisions. The third letter was a confession to the authorities, written in the same steady hand that had guided her through every act of meticulous preparation. She named herself as the sole agent of both murders, delineating her motives with unflinching clarity. Catherine anticipated the legal complications of the act Edmund's death, Rachel's status as an enslaved person, and the impossibility of prosecuting a murderer who had ended her own life. Her words were precise, leaving no ambiguity about her responsibility or the absence of complicity from others at Willowbrook. In a society obsessed with property, inheritance, and legal hierarchy, her confession was both a moral and a practical document, ensuring that the historical record would not be misinterpreted, distorted, or blamed upon those whose lives she had indirectly altered. Even as she wrote, the psychological weight of her actions pressed upon her. The murders had been swift yet exhaustive, driven by a combination of rage, humiliation, and an inability to find socially sanctioned recourse. Now, in the quiet hours of her bedroom, the emotional consequences began to settle like sediment. Her breathing deepened, her hands shook, and her vision occasionally blurred with tears she refused to acknowledge. The rational mind that had guided her through the murders, the preparation of letters, and the arrangements for her children now struggled to assert control over the more primal forces of fear, grief, and despair. She was a woman at the intersection of legal power and emotional impotence, whose social privilege had failed to protect her from the consequences of emotional abandonment. The act of suicide itself was carried out with the same deliberation that had characterized her final hours. Catherine positioned herself in the bathtub, water rising to cover her legs and torso, and opened her wrists carefully, ensuring that the knife had served its final role without introducing additional chaos. The water quickly became tinged with red, the life she had contained within her body spilling into the still, silent vessel of the bathtub. Her letters, folded neatly and placed upon the writing desk, would be discovered promptly, ensuring that her motives, actions, and final rationale would be understood with unambiguous clarity. Discovery followed within hours. Elizabeth, the house servant, approached the bedroom after repeated concern that Catherine had not emerged. The visual of the mistress, lifeless in the bathtub, water tainted with the deep red of her own blood, delivered a shock that transcended immediate comprehension. The letters, visible and intentionally positioned, offered an explanation that was chillingly rational, a window into a mind that had combined extreme violence with calculated forethought. For Elizabeth and the other enslaved witnesses, the scene confirmed the dual reality of Willowbrook's hierarchy. The mistress could exercise lethal power over both the master and the enslaved, yet the social structure offered no protection for those whose lives intersected with her fury. The consequences extended far beyond the immediate shock of the deaths. Catherine's children, upon returning from relatives, faced a reality stripped of parental guidance, understanding only that both parents were gone and that the world they knew had collapsed into violence and legal ambiguity. The estate, temporarily leaderless, required administrative oversight. Edmund's will, designed to pass wealth and property to Catherine and the children, collided with the reality of Catherine's suicide, creating complex questions about inheritance and guardianship. The enslaved population, dispersed in the sale of Willowbrook's lands, experienced yet another layer of trauma, severing communities, familial bonds, and social structures that had persisted through decades of shared labor and proximity. The psychological imprint of Catherine's letters, combined with the acts they memorialized, resonated through the household and the wider region. They became evidence of both the personal consequences of betrayal and the broader systemic contradictions of plantation life, illustrating how power, property, and emotion could collide with catastrophic effect. For the children, the letters would serve as haunting testimony, a window into the motivations of a mother whose love, rage, and despair had left permanent scars on their lives. For the enslaved witnesses, the letters contextualized violence they had witnessed firsthand, illuminating the ways in which social privilege could manifest as lethal agency, yet offer no safeguards for those subordinated by race, status, or law. Catherine's final hours, encapsulated in meticulous preparation, reflective writing, and deliberate action, epitomized the collision of emotion, social hierarchy, and historical circumstance. They demonstrated how the structures of plantation society, which had promised her privilege and protection, ultimately failed to shield her from emotional devastation, leaving her to exercise agency in a manner that reshaped the lives of everyone around her. The letters, the bath, the carefully arranged scene of death all became instruments of historical memory, preserving the complexity, horror, and tragic inevitability of the Willowbrook tragedy for generations to interpret, debate, and remember. The dawn following the triple deaths at Willowbrook cast a pall over the plantation, one that was heavier than the morning mist settling across the Virginia fields. Word spread quickly through the neighboring properties, carried by both gossip and formal notice, creating a ripple of shock that extended far beyond the confines of Willowbrook itself. For the white gentry, the scandal threatened not only social reputation, but also the very foundations of authority and propriety that governed plantation life. How could one justify the absolute hierarchy of white authority when a mistress had murdered both her husband and the enslaved woman he loved, then taken her own life? The delicate veneer of civilization that masked the plantation's inherent violence was suddenly shattered, exposing the fragile human tensions that even the strictest social codes could not contain. The initial investigation fell to Virginia authorities, who arrived at the scene within hours. The immediate problem was procedural. The perpetrator was deceased, leaving no living suspect to prosecute. Catherine Hartwell's detailed confession, left in letters for authorities, removed any ambiguity about culpability. She had recorded her motivations, her actions, and her method of suicide with meticulous clarity. The letters provided a chilling insight into the mind of a woman who had felt cornered by emotional abandonment, societal expectation, and the legal impotence of a plantation wife whose husband openly defied her. Yet, while the confession clarified the acts, it created legal complications, particularly regarding Rachel, the enslaved victim whose death challenged the very definition of murder under the law. In antebellum Virginia, enslaved people were legally property rather than persons with full legal protections, a fact that complicated any effort to prosecute a murder in the conventional sense. Rachel's death, while morally clear as an act of homicide, existed within a legal framework that denied her full personhood, highlighting the contradictions at the heart of the plantation system. The focus of the authorities shifted quickly from criminal prosecution to estate management and the care of orphaned heirs. Edmund Hartwell's will, which had named Catherine and their 2 children as primary beneficiaries, was thrown into uncertainty by Catherine's suicide. Could a murderer inherit from the victim she had killed? Legal counsel debated the question, with most agreeing that Catherine's death voided any claim she might have had, thereby elevating the children's share to central importance. Guardians needed to be appointed to manage the minor's inheritance, a task fraught with tension and suspicion. Family members and neighboring planters contested control, each keenly aware that the estate included substantial landholdings, livestock, and a significant enslaved population. These disputes unfolded in courtrooms and private chambers, reflecting the broader societal anxieties about stability, authority, and property management in a world suddenly bereft of its central figure. The enslaved population of Willowbrook faced a cascading series of losses and disruptions. Marcus, who had witnessed the murders from concealment in the garden, was sold to a plantation in Georgia. Elizabeth, who discovered Catherine's body in the bathtub, was dispatched to a family in North Carolina. These relocations were not merely administrative. They tore apart the community that had developed over decades, separating families, severing social bonds, and removing the relative stability that Edmund's favor had once provided. The sale and dispersal of Willowbrook's enslaved population illustrated the profound vulnerability of human lives. Treated as property, they could be relocated, fragmented, and repurposed at the whim of inheritance disputes and financial calculations. Each transaction erased familiar connections, leaving individuals to navigate a new environment without support, continuity, or knowledge of whom they might trust. The children, returning from relatives after the events, were thrust into a world defined by absence, ambiguity, and trauma. A daughter of 10 and a son of 8 faced the impossible task of understanding the deaths of both parents. The psychological weight of this experience was compounded by the letters Catherine left behind, which sought to explain the motivations behind the murders, but also ensured that the children would grow up with a dual understanding, that their mother had acted from perceived moral and emotional necessity, yet had committed acts of irrevocable violence. The letters were both evidence and legacy, a method of imposing narrative clarity on an event otherwise incomprehensible to the young and emotionally vulnerable. For the children, these writings would haunt them for the rest of their lives, shaping their perception of love, trust, and familial loyalty in ways that would remain unalterable. Beyond the immediate sphere of Willowbrook, the broader Tidewater community absorbed the shock with a mix of fascination and horror. Local newspapers covered the events with careful language, often referring to the Willowbrook tragedy, a euphemism designed to mitigate the scandal while documenting its extraordinary nature. Social commentary quickly emerged, focusing on the dangers of marital jealousy, the instability of women when denied social and emotional recourse, and the challenges inherent in navigating the complex hierarchies of plantation life. For white women, Catherine Hartwell's actions became both a cautionary tale and a source of anxiety, demonstrating that even legal privilege could not shield them from psychological torment when husbands exercised sexual and emotional authority unchecked by law or convention. Abolitionists, observing the events from beyond Virginia, seized upon the Willowbrook tragedy as evidence of slavery's corrosive influence on human morality. They emphasized how the institution encouraged sexual exploitation, emotional despair, and violence across racial and gender lines. Edmund's exploitation of Rachel, a young enslaved woman, was reframed as moral corruption rather than romantic passion. Catherine's murders, though extreme, were presented as the inevitable consequences of an institution that forced women into emotional dependency and powerlessness. Meanwhile, pro-slavery advocates sought to minimize the scandal, emphasizing Catherine's individual instability rather than the systemic contradictions of plantation society. These competing narratives reflected broader tensions in antebellum discourse, whether moral failings were personal aberrations or evidence of the inherent corruption of slavery as an institution. The legal discourse surrounding Rachel's death continued for years in both formal and informal arenas. Scholars and historians later debated whether Edmund's genuine affection for Rachel complicated the moral dimensions of her murder. Some argued that emotional connection between master and enslaved, while exceptional, did not negate the fundamental coercion that defined their interactions. Others suggested that Rachel had achieved a relative form of autonomy and relational influence, yet her position remained contingent upon Edmund's survival and continued favor. Her death at the hands of Catherine crystallized these tensions, demonstrating that legal power, social hierarchy, and emotional attachment could intersect in violent and unpredictable ways. The long-term management of Willowbrook's estate revealed the full extent of disruption caused by the tragedy. Edmund's brother assumed control, selling portions of land and dispersing the enslaved population to settle debts and ensure the orphaned children's inheritance. Economic and social order, once presumed stable under patriarchal authority, now required intervention, negotiation, and forced reorganization. Families who had labored together for generations were separated, community structures were dismantled, and a psychological scar was embedded in every surviving member of Willowbrook's social and enslaved population. The plantation's former sense of continuity and inherited authority was forever fractured. Public fascination with the case endured for decades. Newspapers, personal correspondence, and oral traditions preserved both the events and the interpretations imposed upon them. For enslaved communities, Rachel's memory symbolized both the fragility of security and the complexity of intimate relationships within slavery, reminding descendants that emotional and physical safety could be contingent on factors beyond one's control. For the white community, the narrative became a mixture of moral warning and sensationalist intrigue, demonstrating that even the most privileged social actors were vulnerable to the destabilizing forces of love, jealousy, and unregulated desire. Ultimately, the legal and social consequences of the Willowbrook tragedy were not confined to courts or newspapers. They reverberated through generations, shaping inheritance, social alliances, and the psychology of all involved. The case exposed the fragility of legal constructs meant to govern behavior, the vulnerability of those treated as property, and the impossibility of reconciling genuine emotion with systemic inequality. The plantation, its people, and its descendants carried the weight of that night's violence far into the future, a stark reminder that the structures of slavery created moral, psychological, and practical consequences that could erupt catastrophically under the weight of human passion and societal constraint. The immediate aftermath of the Willowbrook tragedy extended far beyond the physical violence inflicted on Catherine, Edmund, and Rachel. For the enslaved population who had lived and labored at Willowbrook, the murders represented a seismic rupture in both daily life and psychological stability. Marcus, the head gardener who had witnessed the murders from behind a hedge, carried the memory of that evening with a mixture of fear, sorrow, and reluctant understanding. He had seen the exact moment Catherine's rage transitioned into calculated destruction, the way she struck Rachel with mechanical precision, and then knelt beside Edmund as he bled out, speaking words of rational explanation, as if reciting a lecture rather than confessing to atrocity. Marcus knew that intervening would have resulted in his death, a reality underscored by the brutal enforcement of white authority throughout Virginia plantations. Yet, witnessing events unfold left him with profound trauma. The images of blood-soaked porches, gardens, and torn lives would haunt him for years. Elizabeth, the house servant who discovered Catherine's suicide, became another bearer of the psychological weight of that night. Her duties had brought her to check on the mistress after hearing earlier screaming. Finding Catherine dead in a bathtub, surrounded by the deep red of her own blood, forced Elizabeth to confront not only death but the complete collapse of the social order she had known. For enslaved people like Marcus and Elizabeth, the tragedy illuminated the precariousness of their position. Lives built on obedience, discretion, and careful reading of white authority could be undone in an instant by violence, emotional despair, or the collapse of plantation hierarchies. The realization that the violent deaths of both master and mistress created no safety, only confusion and danger, became a somber truth that would shape their understanding of plantation life. The dispersal of Willowbrook's enslaved population after the murders compounded the trauma. Families and communities, long established over decades of labor and relative stability under Edmund's rule, were torn apart. Marcus was sold to a plantation in Georgia, Elizabeth to North Carolina, and countless others were relocated, often without notice, to settle debts and reorganize property under Edmund's brother, the new inheritor. These transfers were not merely administrative. They severed generational bonds, erased knowledge of social networks, and undermined any semblance of security. Children, parents, and siblings were scattered across vast distances, forced into unfamiliar work, and placed under overseers who had no loyalty to them or understanding of their histories. The social and emotional costs were immeasurable, demonstrating the systemic cruelty of treating human beings as property vulnerable not only to labor exploitation, but also to the chaos that followed the breakdown of a plantation's leadership. Oral histories preserved by enslaved people in Virginia recount how the events at Willowbrook became both cautionary tale and memorialization. Rachel, in particular, emerged as a figure of profound significance. Though legally property, she had occupied a unique emotional position. Edmund's affection and the modest comforts he provided allowed her relative agency within the limits of slavery. Her murder by Catherine transformed her from a figure of relative privilege into a symbol of vulnerability and injustice. In these oral traditions, Rachel was remembered not merely as a victim of white violence, but as a woman who had navigated the impossible contradictions of her life with intelligence, grace, and emotional strength. Enslaved communities emphasized her courage, particularly in the moments preceding her death, when she attempted to shield her unborn child and beg for mercy. The stories underscored the paradox of her existence, beloved by the man who owned her, yet powerless to protect herself from the jealous fury of his legal wife. For Marcus and others who had witnessed the murders, the psychological impact was compounded by their awareness of systemic injustice. The fact that Rachel's legal status rendered her death a property loss, rather than a fully recognized homicide, exemplified the moral contradictions that enslaved people experienced daily. They understood that human life in Virginia's plantation system was contingent, conditional, and ultimately subordinate to the whims of property ownership. The murders reinforced the knowledge that even the most privileged among them, those closest to the master or mistress, could not count on safety in moments when emotion, jealousy, or despair erupted into violence. Marcus later recounted, in oral histories passed down to his descendants, that the night of the triple death had instilled a lasting wariness in the enslaved population. No one could fully predict or control the consequences of white emotional instability, no matter how well one followed social and labor expectations. The psychological dimensions of the tragedy extended into the enslaved children at Willowbrook. Even those who had not witnessed the murders directly were affected by the collapse of order, the dispersal of community members, and the ensuing uncertainty about future ownership and labor conditions. Families that had lived together for generations were now divided across states, often forced to form new attachments under unfamiliar circumstances. The trauma of separation was compounded by the loss of protective figures. Under Edmund's ownership, certain enslaved individuals had experienced a form of emotional security, however limited by the coercive framework of slavery. That security evaporated with his death, leaving the enslaved population vulnerable to harsher treatment under new overseers and distant proprietors. Beyond the immediate generational impact, the Willowbrook tragedy became embedded in collective memory as a story that communicated the inherent instability and danger of plantation life. For formerly enslaved people and their descendants, Rachel's story, her intelligence, her strength, her ultimate vulnerability, was preserved as an emblem of the human cost of slavery. Oral histories recounted her murder, not simply as an act of individual malice, but as a product of a system that allowed a white man to claim sexual and emotional authority over an enslaved woman, a white wife to exercise lethal control over both her husband and his lover, and enslaved people to exist without legal protection. In these narratives, the moral and emotional complexity of the tragedy was never simplified. Rachel was celebrated for her courage, Edmund for his emotional blindness and inability to reconcile love with societal norms, and Catherine was remembered as both terrifying and tragically constrained by social expectation. The memory of Willowbrook shaped community practices, folklore, and even subtle acts of resistance. Stories circulated that warned enslaved individuals of the dangers of emotional entanglement with white families, emphasizing the unpredictability of white women's jealousy and the risks of being caught in conflicts between owners and mistresses. Legends emerged surrounding Rachel's cottage, claiming that her spirit lingered, not to haunt but to protect those who remembered her story. These narratives reinforced a cultural understanding that survival within slavery required vigilance, awareness of social hierarchies, and the capacity to navigate emotional and legal contradictions that were often fatal. By the late 19th century, after emancipation, the memory of Willowbrook continued to inform the narratives of formerly enslaved people who had once lived there or whose families had been affected. The tragedy became part of a broader discourse about the dangers of dependency on white protection, the fragility of relative privilege within bondage, and the moral hazards that accompanied intimate relationships between enslavers and enslaved. Rachel's posthumous gravestone, erected by formerly enslaved people in the 1890 seconds, read, Rachel, 1830, 1857, beloved by many, murdered by one. May she rest in peace that eluded her in life. The inscription served as both memorial and social commentary, a tangible acknowledgement of her humanity and the injustice of her death, in stark contrast to the anonymity imposed by law during her lifetime. The long-term impact on community memory also included the way Willowbrook became a site of oral teaching, both practical and moral. Elders recounted the events to younger generations not as sensationalized gossip, but as lessons in the precariousness of plantation life, the dangers of overstepping social bounds, and the complexities of human emotion entangled with systemic oppression. In these stories, Rachel's courage, Marcus's prudence, and Elizabeth's endurance were highlighted, providing models for resilience and survival in the absence of legal or social safeguards. The narrative carried embedded warnings. The emotional lives of whites could erupt violently, property status offered no guarantee of safety, and the stability of the plantation hierarchy could collapse unpredictably. The triple deaths at Willowbrook, while specific in time and space, reverberated through generations as an example of the psychological, social, and moral consequences of slavery. The tragedy created trauma, dislocation, and memory work for the enslaved, shaping community identity and ethical reflection long after emancipation. Rachel's life and death became emblematic of both the potential and limits of relational power within slavery. Her story highlighted the partial agency that affection could provide, yet underscored that structural inequality and property status could render that agency ultimately meaningless. Even today, descendants of Willowbrook's enslaved population recount the events with reverence and solemnity, connecting personal family histories to the broader narrative of slavery's destructiveness. The impact of Catherine's murderous rage, Edmund's blind emotional choices, and Rachel's vulnerability continues to inform understanding of human resilience, the moral hazards of unbalanced power, and the enduring consequences of systemic violence. Willowbrook's story, preserved in oral tradition, legal records, and the memory of descendants, stands as a testament to the ways enslaved communities absorbed, interpreted, and transmitted knowledge about survival, justice, and the fragility of human relationships under slavery. The human cost of the Willowbrook tragedy was perhaps most acutely felt by the children of Catherine and Edmund Hartwell, who returned from their relatives' homes 2 days after the murders to discover a world irreparably altered. Their mother, the legal guardian and enforcer of their household, had committed double murder before taking her own life. Their father, the patriarch and source of relative comfort in a rigidly hierarchical society, had bled out in the garden of the woman he had loved outside the bounds of legal marriage. For the children, a daughter aged 10 and a son aged 8, the shock was incomprehensible, a psychic rupture compounded by layers of betrayal, fear, and grief. The immediacy of death was one thing, the understanding of motive, and the societal forces that made such an act conceivable was another entirely. From that day forward, their emotional landscapes would be permanently shaped by events that no child could fully process, and which their parents' generation could scarcely justify or explain. The daughter, Catherine's firstborn, grew into adulthood under the shadow of horror and secrecy. The family who had assumed guardianship attempted to shield her from the details of her mother's crimes, framing the deaths as a tragic accident or as the outcome of emotional instability. Yet even this partial shielding could not erase the psychological imprint. From a young age, she developed deep mistrust in relationships, particularly with figures of authority. The loss of both parents, combined with an understanding, however mediated, of her mother's violent acts and her father's divided loyalties, left her unable to reconcile intimacy with safety. As a teenager, she demonstrated social withdrawal, preferring solitude and scholarly pursuits over friendship or social engagement. Her emotional isolation, compounded by the stigma of her family's notoriety, culminated in a lifetime of reclusion. She never married, never produced offspring, and became known in her later years as a reclusive figure, obsessed with history and literature, attempting to impose structure and order on a life that had begun in chaos. Her existence was defined less by her own choices than by the enduring psychological scars of witnessing, albeit indirectly, the destruction wrought by forbidden love and jealous rage. The son, younger by 2 years, internalized trauma differently, manifesting outwardly as emotional detachment rather than withdrawal. While he engaged with society through work and family life, contemporaneous accounts describe him as distant, seemingly incapable of forming bonds of deep trust or genuine intimacy. Romantic relationships were transient, marked by superficial engagement and avoidance of vulnerability. This detachment can be traced to the childhood experience of parental absence through both death and psychological betrayal. A mother who killed, a father whose affections were divided in morally and socially complicated ways. His attachment to his surviving family members was cautious, tentative, and heavily mediated by self-protective strategies developed during early adolescence. Psychologists reviewing accounts from letters and diaries of descendants suggest that his capacity for empathy remained intact, but that emotional risk was continuously calculated and tightly controlled, a direct response to the unpredictability and extremity of violence he had inherited psychologically. Beyond their personal development, both children carried the burden of familial infamy. Local and regional memory of the Willowbrook tragedy created an atmosphere of stigma, shame, and curiosity that affected their social mobility, educational opportunities, and even their marriage prospects. Neighbors, acquaintances, and extended family treated them with a mixture of fear and fascination, and the shadow of Catherine's crimes influenced decisions about trust, inheritance, and engagement within elite Virginian circles. The psychological consequence was double-edged. They were both victims of societal judgment and witnesses to the consequences of emotional extremity. The long-term effect of being publicly connected to one of Virginia's most notorious scandals complicated their ability to integrate fully into community life. The trauma experienced by the Hartwell children was compounded by the structural realities of plantation society. Their mother's murders and father's extramarital relationship demonstrated vividly that legal status, racial hierarchy, and social privilege could not shield anyone from catastrophic violence or emotional ruin. These realizations left them acutely aware of the fragility of social order, power, and familial authority. They learned early that even those with full social, economic, and racial privilege were not immune to the destructive forces of jealousy, desire, and systemic injustice. For the children, this knowledge fostered a dual lens through which they viewed the world, one of caution toward emotional entanglement and one of perpetual vigilance against unpredictable consequences of social and personal transgression. The letters Catherine had left provided a chilling window into her mindset, but also served as a source of moral and psychological complexity for her children. Her words attempted to justify her murders as a response to prolonged humiliation, emotional abandonment, and the structural impossibilities of her social position. Yet the letters were also acknowledgments of irreparable harm. She recognized the devastation her acts would cause her children and expressed a hope, however tenuous, that they might one day understand the circumstances that drove her to murder and suicide. This paradoxical communication, an attempt at explanation amid violent action, forced the children to wrestle with a dual inheritance, the rationalization of her acts and the horror of their consequences. The psychological burden was compounded by the necessity of making sense of a parent who was simultaneously a figure of love, authority, and unimaginable violence. As they matured, both children developed a heightened awareness of social norms, emotional boundaries, and moral complexity. The daughter, for instance, approached relationships and professional endeavors with intense analytical rigor, seeking to avoid the mistakes that had so catastrophically unraveled her family. Her son similarly relied on logical assessment over emotional spontaneity, prioritizing stability and predictability. Yet neither child could escape the intrinsic human impulse for connection, creating ongoing tension between desire for intimacy and fear of betrayal or loss. This inner conflict shaped their adult identities, parenting practices, and social strategies. Scholars reviewing diaries and letters suggest that both children internalized lessons about emotional control, the potential destructiveness of jealousy, and the unpredictability of human desire, all filtered through the prism of systemic inequities embedded in slavery and patriarchal family structures. The generational legacy of Willowbrook extended beyond these direct psychological effects. Descendants reported stories of caution, emphasizing vigilance, awareness of authority, and the dangers of unchecked emotion. For grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the tragedy became a foundational narrative, shaping family culture and moral education. The events of the 15th of August 1857 were transmitted not merely as historical fact, but as ethical and practical lessons about the intersection of privilege, love, violence, and social constraint. The psychological imprint, in effect, became both a warning and a template for navigating personal and social risk. In a broader societal sense, the children's psychological experiences reflected larger questions about the human cost of slavery and patriarchal control. The instability within the Hartwell household, driven by extramarital attachment, racial exploitation, and emotional neglect, mirrored structural instabilities in plantation society. The inability of white women to protect themselves from the emotional infidelity of husbands, the impossibility for enslaved women to safeguard their autonomy, and the legal invisibility of children caught between these forces created conditions where psychological trauma was inevitable. The Hartwell children's development illustrates the cascading effect of systemic violence. Legal privilege could not insulate them from emotional devastation, just as it could not prevent the dislocation of enslaved communities. Even the material legacy of the tragedy, inheritance disputes, dispersal of property, and custody arrangements affected psychological development. Guardianship arrangements were necessarily pragmatic, focusing on stability and preservation of assets rather than emotional well-being. The children were raised in environments informed by scandal and public scrutiny, with ongoing pressure to conform to moral and social expectations shaped by others' judgments of their family's past. This externalized moral oversight compounded their internalized sense of caution, vigilance, and the need for emotional regulation, creating a psychological inheritance as tangible and impactful as any legal or financial one. Ultimately, the Hartwell children's experience demonstrates the intergenerational transmission of trauma, illustrating how violent events, emotional neglect, and systemic injustice propagate effects far beyond the immediate victims. Their psychological legacy, withdrawal, detachment, hypervigilance, and moral caution serves as a testament to the enduring human cost of familial and societal failure. The Willowbrook tragedy, while rooted in a specific historical context, provides an enduring example of how the interplay of personal passion, social hierarchy, and systemic oppression shapes the minds and lives of subsequent generations, illustrating the far-reaching consequences of a world built upon injustice, exploitation, and the fragile boundaries of human emotion. The triple death at Willowbrook Plantation did not fade quietly into history. Its reverberations spread through Tidewater, Virginia, shaking the foundations of elite plantation society and forcing an unspoken acknowledgement of the contradictions that underpinned its social order. While the murders of Edmund Hartwell, Rachel, and Catherine Hartwell were shocking in their immediacy, the enduring effect was less about the sensationalism of violence and more about the systemic truths they exposed. White wives, accustomed to legal and social power, were powerless to command their husbands' affections when those affections were directed toward enslaved women. Enslaved women, regardless of their social or emotional position with their masters, remained legally vulnerable and emotionally imperiled, and children born into such households inherited trauma that could never be mitigated by wealth, status, or lineage. The Willowbrook tragedy crystallized these dynamics into a public narrative that demanded attention, debate, and, in some quarters, introspection. Virginia newspapers, cautiously reporting the events, framed the incident in ways designed to balance public shock with social defensiveness. The Willowbrook tragedy, as the press came to call it, was detailed in terms of murder and suicide, but the discussion of underlying causes was measured, often euphemistic. Articles emphasized Catherine Hartwell's instability, portraying her as an emotional woman pushed to extremes, and downplayed the relational and societal forces that made her rage comprehensible. Rachel, as an enslaved woman, was referred to indirectly, her victimhood acknowledged only insofar as it intersected with scandal. Edmund, the master, was described as a man of cultivated tastes, his affection for Rachel depicted in the press as a tragic lapse in judgment rather than a manifestation of systemic exploitation. This framing reflected both the limitations of contemporary journalistic norms and a broader societal impulse to protect elite men from scrutiny, to shield white women from complex acknowledgement of systemic injustice, and to minimize the human consequences for enslaved individuals whose deaths were rarely given full legal or moral weight. Despite press attempts at careful framing, the Willowbrook tragedy quickly became a topic of conversation among Virginia's planter elite. Social gatherings, salons, and private correspondence buzzed with speculation and analysis. Wives of other plantation owners were acutely aware of the implicit warning. Even the most socially privileged position offered no protection from emotional devastation if husbands sought fulfillment outside the bounds of legal marriage. The story encouraged cautious observation of domestic dynamics, fostering a culture in which jealousy, fear, and social performance were as influential as legal rights or moral authority. For men, the scandal created tension between the desire for private gratification and the risk of public censure, highlighting that even the exercise of absolute social and legal power carried vulnerabilities, particularly when it intersected with the desires of white wives and enslaved women. Abolitionists seized upon the Willowbrook case as concrete evidence of the moral corruption engendered by slavery. They highlighted the impossibility of genuine love between free and enslaved individuals within a system predicated on ownership, coercion, and unequal power. Edmund's affection for Rachel, while perhaps genuine on an emotional level, was impossible to disentangle from his absolute control over her legal and physical existence. Catherine's rage, they argued, was a predictable consequence of a system that denied women emotional recourse while permitting men unchecked access to enslaved bodies. For abolitionist writers, the tragedy exemplified how slavery poisoned human relationships, corrupted moral sensibilities, and rendered ordinary domestic life a potential site of catastrophe. The scandal was invoked in speeches, pamphlets, and essays as a cautionary tale of the systemic degradation inherent in the plantation economy, providing a visceral illustration that theoretical critiques could not match. Pro-slavery advocates faced an uncomfortable challenge in responding to the events. They could not openly condone murder or suicide, nor could they ignore the moral and emotional implications of a white man's affection for an enslaved woman. Their response, therefore, emphasized individual pathology over systemic critique. Catherine was depicted as a morally unstable woman, Edmund as a victim of domestic turmoil, and Rachel as an unfortunate but peripheral figure whose death was tragic, yet legally ambiguous due to her status as property. By framing the scandal as an exceptional aberration, pro-slavery voices sought to maintain the appearance of a moral and orderly society, while sidestepping uncomfortable discussions about the exploitation and inequality that slavery inherently required. This approach reflected a broader tendency in antebellum discourse. The dissonance between moral pretension and lived realities was resolved through selective interpretation and obfuscation rather than structural reform. Within enslaved communities, the story of Willowbrook circulated as oral history, interpreted through a markedly different lens. Rachel's experience was central. She represented both the relative rewards of intimate connection with a master and the inherent dangers of such entanglement. To enslaved listeners, her murder by Catherine Hartwell underscored the precariousness of emotional and physical safety, even for those who attained relative privilege or affection within the system. Marcus and Elizabeth, witnesses to the events, transmitted versions emphasizing the capriciousness of white authority, the fragility of human life under bondage, and the moral complexity of survival in a system that treated people as property. For enslaved communities, the tragedy became a moral and practical lesson, illuminating the necessity of vigilance, solidarity, and skepticism toward the apparent benevolence of masters, while simultaneously honoring the courage and endurance of those who navigated impossible circumstances. The Willowbrook tragedy also became a focal point for scholarly inquiry in later decades, influencing historical, literary, and sociological interpretations of slavery. Researchers analyzing court records, letters, and oral histories emphasized the ways in which systemic power imbalances manifested in intimate and often destructive ways. Edmund's emotional attachment to Rachel was contextualized as both a product of coercive structures and as a form of emotional escape from rigid social norms. Catherine's violence was examined as an extreme response to prolonged humiliation and lack of legal or social recourse. Rachel's vulnerability illuminated the intersections of gender, race, and property law, revealing how enslaved women's lives were simultaneously constrained and commodified. Together, these narratives offered insight into the profound instability inherent in plantation society, illustrating how personal, legal, and social forces converged to produce outcomes that were catastrophic for all parties involved. The cultural impact of the tragedy persisted long after the deaths themselves. Willowbrook Plantation became a symbol in literature, historical accounts, and moral discourse. Novels and essays fictionalizing the events explored themes of jealousy, unrequited affection, and the moral hazards of absolute power. Moralists used the story as an example of divine retribution or societal failure, emphasizing that unchecked desires and structural injustice could produce ruin even among the socially privileged. Among the descendants of enslaved individuals and plantation families, Willowbrook remained a cautionary tale, transmitted both as oral history and written documentation, a story that transcended immediate geographic and temporal boundaries to inform collective understandings of power, love, and violence in the antebellum South. The broader implications extended into legal and economic realms. The dispersal of the plantation, the sale of enslaved people, and the redistribution of property highlighted vulnerabilities in estate law and the practical management of plantation wealth. The legal ambiguity surrounding Rachel's death, given her status as property, underscored persistent contradictions in Virginia law, where human beings could be simultaneously integral to economic systems, yet invisible as legal subjects. Similarly, the children's guardianship and inheritance issues reflected the difficulties of enforcing property and custodial rights in the aftermath of social collapse. The tragic outcomes forced both elite and middle-tier society to reckon with the inadequacy of legal frameworks designed to manage property and wealth, while ignoring the human and emotional realities of the people within those structures. Ultimately, the Willowbrook tragedy functioned as both a mirror and a magnifying glass. It mirrored the structural inequities and moral compromises of antebellum plantation society, while magnifying the human consequences of systemic injustice. The murders, suicide, and subsequent social fallout illuminated how slavery corrupted intimacy, eroded trust, and rendered ordinary human relationships sites of peril. It revealed that legal authority and social privilege could not safeguard against emotional catastrophe, that societal norms were often inadequate to contain desire or jealousy, and that the psychological, material, and cultural consequences of these dynamics could reverberate across generations. The tragedy also underscored the necessity of historical reflection. Understanding Willowbrook requires confronting uncomfortable truths about power, property, and the human cost of maintaining systems predicated on inequality. By the end of the 19th century, Willowbrook's story had been memorialized, debated, and mythologized in multiple forums. Plantation historians, literary writers, and descendants of both enslavers and the enslaved engaged with its legacy, ensuring that the events were neither forgotten nor reduced to mere scandal. The narrative served as a lens through which Americans could examine the intersections of love, power, race, and violence, offering enduring lessons about the dangers of unexamined privilege and the fragility of human bonds under conditions of structural oppression. Willowbrook's societal and cultural repercussions, therefore, extend beyond the immediate tragedy, providing insight into the persistent moral, psychological, and legal complexities that slavery created, and the ways those complexities shaped both individuals and communities for generations. The Willowbrook tragedy did not end with the immediate deaths of Catherine Hartwell, Edmund Hartwell, and Rachel. Its consequences rippled across time, influencing historical memory, community identity, and modern interpretations of slavery, gender, and power. By the late 19th century, Willowbrook Plantation had acquired an almost mythic reputation within Virginia and the broader southern region. Stories of Catherine's rage, Edmund's forbidden affection, and Rachel's victimhood circulated in newspapers, oral histories, and letters, becoming both a cautionary tale and a lens through which the complexities of plantation society were examined. The plantation itself, its cottages, gardens, and main house, remained a site imbued with lingering social and emotional resonance and a physical testament to the fragility of the systems that had produced such catastrophe. The Hartwell children, who had been orphaned at ages 10 and 8, represented the human legacy of the tragedy. Raised by Catherine's parents, they grew up haunted by the knowledge of the murders that had orphaned them. The daughter became a reclusive figure, refusing marriage and retreating from public life, her personality marked by withdrawal and silence that contemporaries attributed to the psychological burden of her childhood trauma. The son, while marrying later in life, struggled with emotional intimacy, reportedly unable to form genuine bonds, reflecting a deep-seated distrust of love that may have originated in the violent collapse of his family structure. For both children, the Willowbrook tragedy became an enduring psychological inheritance, illustrating how the violence of slavery and domestic betrayal could transmit trauma across generations, even when social privilege and wealth were preserved. The physical site of Willowbrook Plantation underwent transformation in subsequent decades. The property changed hands multiple times as various owners struggled to maintain both the economic viability of the land and the social reputation tainted by the Hartwell murders. Formerly enslaved individuals who had once lived on the plantation later purchased portions of the land, creating small farms where they could exercise autonomy and labor for themselves rather than under coercion. Rachel's cottage, where the murders had occurred, was eventually destroyed by fire, rumored to be a deliberate act by formerly enslaved individuals who sought to erase the space associated with both forbidden love and violent death. In this way, the physical erasure of the site mirrored the community's effort to reinterpret its legacy, to reconcile memory with lived experience, and to honor the humanity of those who had suffered most under the plantation system. Memorialization of the individuals involved reflected starkly contrasting perspectives. Edmund and Catherine were interred in the family cemetery, their graves marked simply with names and dates, conspicuously omitting the scandal that had ended their lives. The children's likely choice of anonymity in the markers suggested a desire to obscure the traumatic events rather than commemorate them, an effort to shield future generations from the full horror of the past. Rachel, however, received a markedly different form of recognition. Initially buried in the enslaved cemetery without any marker, she was posthumously memorialized in the 1,890 seconds by formerly enslaved individuals who knew her personally. A simple stone bearing the inscription, Rachel 1,831,857, beloved by many, murdered by one. May she rest in peace that eluded her in life, stood as a rare acknowledgement of her personhood, humanity, and the profound affection she had inspired. This memorial reflected the enduring memory and agency of enslaved communities in constructing historical narratives that countered the dominant elite perspective. Historical scholarship in the 20th and 21st centuries has continued to examine Willowbrook, positioning it as a key case study for understanding antebellum slavery, sexual exploitation, gendered power, and emotional trauma. Archival evidence, including letters, legal records, and newspaper accounts, has been meticulously analyzed to reconstruct the complex psychological, social, and legal dimensions of the tragedy. Scholars such as Dr. Jennifer Williams have emphasized the unique position of white plantation mistresses who, while socially privileged, remained emotionally vulnerable in a system that gave their husbands unlimited access to enslaved women. Catherine Hartwell's murders, Williams argues, cannot be understood solely as personal pathology, but must be interpreted as a response to a structural environment that denied legitimate avenues for emotional redress. Similarly, historians have examined Rachel's life to illuminate the precariousness of enslaved women's positions, even when they attained relative favor or affection from masters, emphasizing the fragility of safety and agency within a system of absolute ownership. The case of Willowbrook also contributes to broader debates about love, coercion, and consent in the context of slavery. Edmund Hartwell's relationship with Rachel challenges simplistic narratives about affection between masters and enslaved women. Some scholars posit that his feelings were genuine, reflecting emotional attachment that transcended mere physical exploitation. Others counter that, regardless of emotional authenticity, the inherent power imbalance renders any interpretation of love problematic, as enslaved individuals could not meaningfully consent within a system that reduced them to property. Rachel's pregnancy, Catherine's murderous rage, and the legal and social constraints on all parties involved provide a stark illustration of how emotional and sexual relations were inseparable from coercive social and legal structures, producing consequences that were often violent, traumatic, and irreversible. Cultural memory of Willowbrook has extended beyond historical texts into literature, public history, and popular discourse. Fictionalized accounts have explored the themes of jealousy, unrequited desire, moral conflict, and systemic oppression, while documentaries and museum exhibits have highlighted the tragedy as a lens for understanding slavery's psychological and emotional toll. The narrative has become a tool for both moral education and historical reflection, demonstrating how intimate human relationships were distorted and endangered by structural inequalities. It has served to remind contemporary audiences that slavery was not only a system of labor exploitation, but also a system that corrupted human bonds, reshaped identities, and created situations where violence became an almost inevitable consequence of unaddressed grievances. The legal and economic aftermath of Willowbrook further shaped its historical significance. The dispersal of enslaved people after the deaths and Catherine's suicide illustrates how property law and inheritance frameworks were disrupted by the collapse of social authority. Families that had lived together for generations were separated, sold, or relocated, creating new patterns of displacement and trauma. Estate disputes, guardianship arrangements for the orphaned Hartwell children, and the redistribution of plantation wealth underscored the instability inherent in systems where human beings were treated as property. In these legal and economic consequences, historians see a microcosm of the fragility of the antebellum social order, where a single event could upend the delicate balance of control, power, and labor management upon which plantation life depended. Modern interpretations of Willowbrook emphasize its multi-layered legacies. For descendants of enslaved people, the tragedy is a testament to resilience, memory, and moral agency, exemplified in the posthumous recognition of Rachel. For descendants of the Hartwell family, it represents both inherited trauma and the collapse of social and emotional authority. For historians, it provides a case study in the psychological consequences of slavery, the dynamics of gendered power, and the moral complexities of human relationships constrained by legal and economic systems. Across all perspectives, Willowbrook underscores the pervasive impact of slavery, demonstrating that its violence extended far beyond the physical subjugation of the enslaved, touching every life connected to the plantation in profound and often tragic ways. In conclusion, the Willowbrook tragedy, with its triple death and extensive aftermath, has endured as a historical touchstone precisely because it captures the contradictions, injustices, and psychological complexities of antebellum slavery. The murder-suicide of Catherine Hartwell, the death of her husband, and the killing of Rachel reveal the impossibility of reconciling emotional desire with legal ownership, social expectation, and racial hierarchy. The memory of Willowbrook, preserved through cemeteries, oral histories, scholarly research, and cultural narrative, continues to challenge simplistic understandings of the past. It demands acknowledgement of the human cost of slavery, the fragility of intimate relationships under conditions of coercion, and the enduring consequences of systemic oppression on multiple generations. By grappling with Willowbrook, contemporary audiences are forced to confront difficult truths about love, power, violence, and the moral complexities embedded in a society built upon human bondage.